Hi, this is Linda, and I'm going to walk you through a brief introduction to how you can use numbers more effectively for better communication of safety data. So, what I'm going to talk about in this brief introduction is how to use numbers effectively, including how to translate numbers to human terms, how to ground numbers in familiar scales, using emotional numbers, and building scale models with numbers. So let me ask you first, how often do your safety training or presentations include numbers or statistics? My guess is that it's pretty often, and I also ask you why. Is it because it's expected? People want to see them? And if you do include numbers and statistics, do you show things such as charts in the background? If you do, you can guess that this may not be the best way to share numerical information or data with your audience. So some common safety presentation contents look like this blue area on the right, and this is a sample of a real presentation that I found online from Washington State from 2006, which shows their fatalities. As you see, it's numbers with numbers. I say numbers like numbered items with numbers to the right. And these really don't jump out at you. They don't show any special meaning. Really, really confusing with this note at the bottom about normalizing data. Also, if you're like me, this color combination is really, really intense. I do not like looking at this yellow on the blue. So if you must use numbers, talking again about using them effectively, translating them to human terms, ground in familiar scales, emotional, and building scale models. So translating numbers to human terms. This is a question I like to ask to really show this point. So if someone said to you, how big is 500 acres? If you are from Texas or maybe grew up on a ranch, maybe you have a really good idea of this. I am from the city and I would have no idea how big 500 acres is. I couldn't really even guess how much space this covers. This is Disneyland in California, and this is actually 500 acres. If you've been to Disneyland in California, you may imagine the size of this space, and that would make it more realistic to you, and you'd have an idea. If you haven't been there, you may still not have a really good idea about how much space this is. So imagine this was a television headline, 500 acres of land preserved. Again, if you're not familiar with acres, you would really not be really impressed with 500 acres preserved because you wouldn't know how big that is. So again, how big is 500 acres? This is another example. With all of these examples, you really want to tie it to something people are familiar with. So if your audience are NFL or college football fans, using something that helps them understand the size in respect to a football field will be more effective than just saying how many blocks or Disneyland or something like that. So you want to really tie the image to what your audience is familiar with. So 500 acres is shown below 379 football fields, because one football field is approximately 1.32 acres. And all of these numbers are easily found online. So if you can picture 379 football fields, that might still be a little difficult for you to wrap your head around and to do that. So you can break it down even further in figuring out how many people could fit inside one of those football fields. So doing some calculations, you get 28,800 people can fit inside one football field, right? So that's something you can more easily get your mind around. How many people 28,000 people are? That's a lot of people. So imagine that times 379. All right, so hopefully you get the idea that you want to kind of relate your numbers to an image or an experience that your audience is more familiar with so that it has more meaning. So number 2 is to ground familiars in familiar scales. Some of the best way to do that is through weight, education, aging, years, daily, or days, weeks of the month. So if you are ever gone through an ergonomic class, you may have had someone tell you that your head weighs approximately the pounds of a bowling ball, the same as a bowling ball. So that's, say, 11 pounds is what your head weighs. So when you're thinking about how to sit up straight, and you shouldn't have your head bent over because that's the amount of pounds that you're really holding on your neck, you can think of a bowling ball. And a lot of people, or used to be at least, very familiar with how much a bowling ball weighed. I don't think bowling balls are as commonly known anymore. I don't know how popular bowling is, but that's just one idea to help visualize how much 11 pounds is. Other examples are grading systems, such as education. Most people are very familiar with A's, B's, C's. If you've gone to traditional school, you're familiar with how things are graded. You can also say this number is equivalent to an A plus. This number is equivalent to failing, just to really help make a difference. When it comes to the fire extinguisher example here, if I remember this correctly, a disposable fire extinguisher needs to be replaced every 5 years. So if you say to someone, if you bought a fire extinguisher when you had a baby, when that child was starting kindergarten, you would need to get rid of that fire extinguisher and buy a new one. So that's a period of time which, if someone has had a child go to kindergarten, they can easily kind of remember that time frame and remember how long that was. The example on the right is if you bought a rechargeable fire extinguisher, it would last approximately 18 years. So you could buy the extinguisher when the child was born, and you wouldn't have to replace it until they were ready to go off to college, a much longer time frame. And if people have had children through any of these periods, to kindergarten or graduation, it'll be much more realistic and easier for them to understand. So imagine you had a company weekly walking challenge, and you wanted people to walk every week and eventually get to a destination. So imagine you had 100 employees, and you wanted each one to walk 10,000 steps per day per 1 week. Okay, that sounds exciting, but trying to visualize 10,000 steps a day for 100 people is strictly just a number. If you combine that, they would collectively walk approximately 3,314 miles. Now, that's a lot more impressive, right? It's thousands and thousands of miles, but it's still a little hard to visualize. So you could take where you're starting, and in this case, it's showing Denver, and plot out where 3,200 miles roughly, or 3,314 miles would be. So if 100 employees walked 10,000 steps a day for 1 week, they could get from Denver to Anchorage in a week, right? And people really have a general idea about how far that distance is, so it's easier for them to visualize how significant this amount really could be. The other example here shows a thermometer, and this is a really popular way of people who fundraise, showing how much is left to donate. So if someone said we need $1,324 still to meet our goal, that's just a number and it's hard to visualize. But if you show it as part of the whole, in this case was $30,000, and on the thermometer, you can really see how close this goal is to being achieved. So another example about $1 million, right? If someone said, what would you do with $1 million? $1 million is, to me personally, a lot of money, and it's hard for me to visualize how much this is. So you ask people, how long would it last you, right? So if you had $1 million, you might think, $1 million would last me a few years. If you break it down further, if you ask someone, could you spend $10,000 per day? Most people will be like, yeah, maybe a couple of days, maybe not. But if you spent $10,000 a day, your $1 million would last you 100 days, or just a little over 3 months. When you think of it that way, it really can help you wrap your head around how much $1 million is or isn't in this case, because to me, I would have expected $1 million would last a whole lot longer. So you can tie the same idea when you're trying to convince management or someone to buy something that costs a lot of money, when you compare it to the cost really of not buying an equipment or a service or anything along those lines. So the cost of workplace equipment can vary widely depending on the industry and the specific type of equipment. So these are just a few examples of equipment that might cost around $35,000. CNC machine or a computer numerical control machine, which is used in manufacturing for cutting and shaping of materials. An industrial robot, which can be used on assembly lines for things such as welding, painting, material handling. Commercial vehicles, such as delivery trucks or vans. Medical equipment, such as some diagnostic machines like ultrasound or x-ray machines. Also construction equipment, such as a small excavator or a skid steer loader or a backhoe. Or a printing press, which is used in the printing industry, or high-end office equipment, such as some really advanced photocopiers or multifunction printers for large offices. So this is just really a wide variety of things that can cost $35,000. And why did I pick that? Was because that's also the average cost of one sprain or strain in the workplace. So if you're trying to convince someone, management, boss, anyone, to buy something to help relieve the occurrence of sprains and strains in the workplace, you can go back to something that's common in your industry and try to equate it with the cost of the injury. So as an example, say your company is a small company with lots of delivery trucks. Say you have 10 delivery trucks and one delivery truck costs $35,000. By putting in a control to help eliminate sprains and strains, your company basically is adding one delivery truck to their inventory. Or if they don't, it's like driving one delivery truck into a wall and losing that delivery truck. It's the same thing as having one sprain or strain occur. Hopefully that makes some sense, but you really want to try to equate it with something particular to your industry. You would not use something like a backhoe or construction equipment, obviously, if you're in an office environment. Then you would use the copier or the printer. So let's talk about emotional numbers. If you've been in a college class that's pretty difficult, you may have had a professor on the first day of class say, look to your right and look to your left. One of you will fail this class. Now, I remember having this said to me in some of my freshman calculus or physics classes, and it's a bad feeling because you look around and 1 out of 3 people that are likely to fail is a pretty high statistic in my mind. So that's what I mean by an emotional number, something that really makes you feel a certain way. Now, a lot of talk has happened lately about the effects of mental health or the negative mental health in a lot of construction. It really is an epidemic, and it's getting a lot of much needed attention. A fact, 1 in 5 construction workers suffer from some kind of mental health issues is something people may say, but if you really just think about that number, you might not realize how common that is. So you could use the same technique. Say you had a class full of construction workers, you have 5 sitting at a table. You could say, one of you will have some kind of mental health illness. And that just really helps bring it home a lot better, especially if they know each other really well. One of your friends is going to have a mental health illness. So imagine this statement. In 2023, there were 5,486 fatal work injuries in the United States. Right, that's a lot of injuries, but how would you express that to make it more realistic so people could really understand the sheer size of that number of people? Right, this is an example of a conference. Say you're attending a conference such as ASSP's Professional Development Conference, where there are usually around 5,000-6,000 people. Imagine this conference room has 5,486 people in it, and in 1 year, all of these people die from a work-related injury. Right? To me, that really brings it home and really helps visualize the sheer number of people that we're talking about when you say 5,486. How about this statistic? 2% of the US population will have a car accident this year. Right? How could you make that clearer to your audience? Say you're talking to, I don't know, a bunch of high school students, right? Which the number is probably higher than 2% for high school students, but overall, the general population, 2% will have an accident. How could you make that clearer? Right? Think about the number of conference attendees, how you could break it down, the number of people sitting on a row. If you have a group of 500 people in a giant session or in your company, you have 10 people in the room stand, right? You can really break this down a variety of ways, but the idea is to be really more creative in how you present this. If you have a small training class of 10 people, right, you would probably not use this because 2% would really not make much of an impact, right? You couldn't have a partial person stand up, but try to do these kind of smaller numbers when you have a much larger group to work with. 4, use numbers to build scale models. This one's pretty interesting and takes a bit of time. So here's a bar chart displaying the 10 increasing values between 15,000 and 30,000 over a 10-year period, right? So just a random single back injury cost over a 10-year period. I made up these numbers, but just a very simple chart. You could show this to employees when you're talking about back injury prevention, and they might not care what a back injury costs. You could show it to management or workers' comp people, anybody you like, which shows the average cost of a back injury is $20,000. So start thinking, how could you make this more of an attention-getting image to describe this data? So imagine you work for a construction company. Let me go back to this for a second. Go back to the last one. Nope, I can't do that. But remember, it was $20,000 for a back injury. So say you work for a landscaping company, and it's not that uncommon for people to hurt their backs and have back injuries due to the really amazing weights that they have to lift sometime in landscaping. So if it's a small landscaping company and they don't want to really add any extra equipment to help the heavy lifting be easier, you could translate that to telling them, imagine for 7 days in a row, you're pushing one of our riding mowers off of a cliff. Each riding mower costs about $3,000, 7 days in a row. That's about $21,000. So imagine one back injury, and we would have a riding mower getting pushed over the cliff 7 days in a row. Okay, so a lot of examples here, but I'm hoping you get the idea. I like to visualize things a little further and really show those 7 riding mowers being destroyed, and that's the cost of one back injury. More charts, right? Great to look at. People throw them in all the time. Besides being very difficult to read on a screen, most people eyes are all over the place. They don't know where to go. They don't know where to look. They don't see trends, or they don't know how to interpret them. So again, you want to find a way to really focus on the key information. And down here you see the yellow arrow, and then work with that information. So the number you see here is 425. So what is something that most people are familiar with that could represent 425 people? So instead of saying 425 people are injured, what could you substitute that with? How about an airplane? So depending on the configuration, a Boeing 747 and a 777 have about that same number of people. They hold about 425 people. So when you're talking about 425 people hurt, you could say, imagine every single person on a Boeing 747 having an injury. Let's go back to something safety people are really more familiar with, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. There was 500 workers working in the building that day, and do you know how many died? 146, right? A really good percentage of that number mostly were young women and immigrants. So you don't want to show gruesome images of photos, but you can still use some photos such as this of the young women to help touch on emotions as well. With the 146, we're going to try to think of a creative way to express what 146 is. So consider the school bus, right? How many people fit on the average yellow school bus, which many, many people in the U.S. are very familiar with? School bus holds 50 people. So knowing that, how could you use that information to describe the tragic Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire? Right? We had 146 people died. Let's take a look. 500 workers of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory can be visualized by 10 school buses, right? So all the employees of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory would be in these buses, since each one holds 500 people. Now imagine that 3 of those buses disappeared, crashed, something terrible happened. That represents the number of women who died during that tragic fire. You'll see at the bottom, quote, researchers found that adding one simple comparison sentence doubled how accurately people recalled the facts, such as 3 school buses of people, right? Simple comparison. Instead of people trying to remember 146 people, it's 3 school buses. And being exactly the same, 146 or 150, isn't that important. It's really important that they remember that number of people. So we covered pretty quickly 5 ways you can convey data more effectively so that it's more effective and impactful. The next time you need to present data, try one of these creative approaches. If you do try out some of these really unique ways of presenting your data, I'd love to hear about it, and so would the other subscribers of the Safety Training Net. If you're watching this, you most likely have my contact information. If not, you can check in the comments and let us know what you came up with and how you shared your important safety information and statistics using some of the methods that we talked about today. Thank you for listening, and thank you for all that you do for occupational safety and health.